So, I just watched the new Game of Thrones and I have thoughts. For those obsessed with Game of Thrones, the new prequel series House of the Dragon has been greatly anticipated. I have, with extreme difficulty, been avoiding spoilers for months. So the only thing I knew when I sat down to watch episode 1, Heirs of the Dragon, was that Doctor Who's very own Matt Smith, who is my personal favourite incarnation of the Doctor, had a starring role. Naturally, I was eagerly anticipating the show all the more after learning this. Of course, on top of that, there is also my admittedly somewhat encyclopedic knowledge of Game of Thrones that I have from having read all of the books and reviewing all of the original series. But in terms of what the showrunners have decided to do with the source material, I'm completely blind. So here is my review of Heirs of the Dragon and thoughts on where the series will likely go from here. So if, like me, you prefer to watch spoiler-free, you'll need to skip most of my musings until after you've watched the episode for yourself. However, I would not like to leave you without some idea of the quality you can expect. So here is the spoiler-free version. Visually, the series is everything you'd expect following on from its predecessor. There's plenty of dragon eye candy, stunning and intricately designed sets and costumes, and beautiful people, some of whom have sex and get naked and such like. The one letdown for me was the throne room, which for some reason didn't quite look natural, whether that was a result of the CGI not quite doing it justice or something in the physical set design. I'm not quite sure, but for whatever reason it just didn't quite work. Scenes in the room are very dark. They're not quite long night dark, but they're still difficult to see. And while I really applaud the set designers for creating a design for the Iron Throne, which is a lot more accurately in line with what George R.R. Martin actually wrote about, I feel we didn't quite get the benefit of it because it's so hard to see it properly. One hopes this means, we aren't going to have episodes to come that are going to be poorly lit, but we'll have to wait and find out. As with the original series, the first episode is not without its issues. It's a slow start, largely due to the need to introduce characters and ensure everybody knows what's happening. The only 10 or 15 minutes also has the same painful line delivery that we saw in the first episode of Game of Thrones, back when nobody had settled into the characters yet, and many of them didn't deliver the lines very naturally. Thankfully, that only affected a couple of brief scenes, so for the most part the cast appears to have been very well chosen, and I suspect future episodes won't have any of that in it, as people will have had the chance to sort of fully embrace the world they now inhabit as a reality, rather than talking about it like it's some kind of fake thing. There are some nice nods to the original and the books throughout the episode. I particularly like name dropping A Feast for Crows. That genuinely made me laugh out loud. It was very well done. Much of the dialogue was sharp, with some of the wit that we've come to love from the original. Perhaps not as much as I would have liked, but hopefully that will improve now that we've got the groundwork and the setup and everything's been established. All of that's out of the way. Overall, it didn't disappoint. And I am certainly more excited to see what's coming in the future from it. Now for the spoiler version. Heirs of the Dragon opens with a monologue from Rhaenyra Targaryen, which explains how her father Viserys came to sit the Iron Throne, following the tragic death of both King Jaehaerys' heirs. Now, a council was convened and 14 heir claims were heard, but only 2 were seriously considered. One was Rhaenyra's father, and the other was Rhaenys Targaryen, who was the eldest descendant, but lost out on the throne due to the possession of a vagina. This brief summary nicely introduces us to the resistance to having a queen on the throne. It explains who several of the key players are, perfectly foreshadows a few of the events to come, and as Rhaenyra herself says, Jaehaerys knew full well that the only thing that could topple the might of the Targaryens was themselves. Now, I'm not going to delve too deeply into what we know of this period from the books, but it's evident that the series will be following the events surrounding the so-called Dance of Dragons, not to be confused with the book by the same name. That was a civil war that took place between King Viserys' named heir, which was his eldest child and daughter Rhaenyra, and his eldest son. So Fire and Blood, that's this book, covers these events in detail, and the series has been based on the second half of this book, as well as other details included in the world of Ice and Fire. So one thing I will point out, if memory serves, Jaehaerys' two potential heirs who were considered were both male, I think, meaning that the switch to the queen that never was done deliberately, and if so, that was a really smart move, because not only does it create the perfect setup to explain the issues Rhaenyra will face for the audience, it also adds another strong female character to the royal family, and given that Rhaenyra's own mother tells her in Heirs of a Dragon that she's nothing more than a royal womb, and that the birthing bed is their battlefield, that's very much needed. So, about the heirs. Rhaenyra herself has no real wish to be queen. In a very Arya-esque statement, she proclaims that she wishes only to ride around on her dragon, exploring the world with her bestie and eating cake. Fate, it would seem, has other ideas for her. Much of the runtime of Heirs of the Dragon is spent, as you'd expect, discussing the heirs of King Viserys, who is Rhaenyra's father. At the start of the episode, his wife is heavily pregnant, and Viserys is convinced that she's having a boy, despite the fact Rhaenyra is their only living child, and they have tragically lost 5 others. Viserys is so convinced his heir is about to arrive that he's throwing an expensive and elaborate tournament to celebrate. Unfortunately, things have somewhat pissed off Viserys' current heir, which is his younger brother Daemon, who is played by the wonderful Matt Smith. We love him. Rhaenyra, meanwhile, is feeling somewhat neglected by her father, whose obsession with having a son has always left her feeling a little disconnected from him. So, Rhaenyra is set to be a really interesting character. Millie Alcock performs splendidly as Rhaenyra in this first episode, for the most part, and it's a shame. I think we're only likely to see her in this first episode, or maybe a little bit more going on, as the real meat of House of the Dragon story takes place some years later. So despite this, the kind of the young actress that they've got in for her portraying the character, who is simultaneously completely disinterested in power and angry that her father has never found her good enough to have that power due to the lack of a cock. She does it really well. So there's that, and then there's also the very clear sexual tension between her and her Uncle Daemon, which is a little uncomfortable, you know, for the incest thing and partly for the age gap thing. But it very nicely sets up the potential for the relationship between them later on. We all know Targaryens are no stranger to incest. It's why the Mad King became so mad after all, and why Daenerys herself succumbed to madness, not to mention an illicit affair with her own nephew. Plus, uncle and niece isn't really that shocking after 8 seasons of Jaime and Cersei, I'll be honest with you. As the games begin at the tournament and Rhaenyra's mother goes into labour, the unthinkable happens. It's a breech birth, threatening to kill both the mother and the unborn child, and Viserys is basically forced to sacrifice his wife in order to save his heir. Viserys chooses to have the maester perform a cesarean that essentially kills his wife, as Rhaenyra attends her mother's funeral and delivers the iconic kind of Dracarys command to her dragon, which is awesome. We learn that the life of her brother was also very short-lived, so he's killed his wife for nothing, basically. He's still not got an heir, and while he initially insists that his brother should remain his heir, an unfortunate incident with Daemon causes him to get very annoyed with him and name Rhaenyra instead. What do we think of Daemon? Despite him being painted as the bad guy, it's hard to get a read on him. That's probably a testament to the acting chops of Matt Smith, to be fair. He's clearly ambitious and power hungry. Earlier in the episode, we see him leading the City Watch in their shiny new gold cloaks as they round up a horde of criminals and summarily remove various limbs depending on their crime. So, rapists, say goodbye to your cock. Thieves, you're losing a hand. And murderers, yeah, I hope you don't need your head. So, Daemon wasn't wrong, though, the way he handled this. You know, there was a lot of lawlessness in the city. It was brutal, but it's an effective way of radically bringing order to a lawless city. And he was correct in saying that, you know, people deserve to have the chance to walk through the city free. And if it shocks people into behaving, then why not? During the tournament, there's also an incident where he's sort of struck from behind when he wasn't looking after thinking he'd won. From a guy called Sir Criston Cole. I expected him to kill this guy out of spite before I realised who the guy was, but he yielded and withdrew from the field, which sort of showed him to have more honour in that respect, and honour enough to outweigh his temper and his ambition, which is a stark contrast to other characters that we've seen before, like Joffrey or even the Mountain. So while everyone around Damon may be celebrated and kind of drinking for the death of the heir that would have replaced him, he does toast to it, but you can see from his actual sort of reaction and how he's acting that he only does it because he's a highly charismatic showman and it's what his audience expects. He's actually really sad and grieving. So where's all this leading? Heirs of the Dragon sets up several things quite nicely. The tension between Rhaenyra and her uncle hints at a potential union between the two in the future. The Hand of the King, Otto Hightower, manipulating Viserys into banishing his own brother and then sending his daughter, who happens to be Rhaenyra's best friend, to comfort the widowed king, was clearly done in the hopes that she would become the next queen, she being his daughter. We know where it's heading. If you've never read Fire and Blood, you can still glean everything needed from this episode without a huge amount of exposition. There was very little exposition throughout the episode. The backstory is succinctly delivered in an opening voiceover and a few brief but choice sort of conversations that happen through the show, like Viserys and Aemma discussing their dead children while they're in the bath. Just sort of fills in the rest without you really noticing. There's a lot of name dropping for characters who are likely to be important later. The Baratheons in particular are mentioned a few times and clearly did not support Viserys as the successor when he was named king. It's tough going into a series like this when we already know so much about the world but can't be sure how true to the source material the show intends to be. We've already seen in this one episode that they're willing to kind of fudge details in order to better represent the themes that they want to put across. And it's a difficult balance. There's been quite a lot of buzz about House of the Dragons fixing the sex issues that Game of Thrones had, but honestly, there's still a fair bit. It's part of the charm of the show, though, and humans are nothing but base instincts held together by social mores. Some may find it offensive or even gratuitous, but is that not just another social more trying to keep our base instincts in check? I don't know. Anyway, it's a great episode and I'm looking forward to next week's.